This garden has not been watered once in 60 years, not during the driest August on record, not during the 3-week stretch 2 summers ago when half the county's lawns turned brown and the local news was running segments on watering restrictions. Not ever, in 6 full decades. And it's not some drought-tolerant rock garden with 3 sad succulents in it. This is a full working vegetable garden. Tomatoes, squash, beans, corn, root vegetables. The kind of garden that should need watering 2 or 3 times a week just to survive a normal summer, let alone thrive. The man who built it is Amish, and the method he used isn't a secret exactly. But it's also not something you'll find in a single modern gardening book, because it predates almost everything modern gardening advice is built on. Today I'm going to show you exactly what this method is, why it works, and how you can build a version of it in your own garden regardless of where you live. Stay through to the end, because the way most people try to copy this and get it completely wrong happens in the very first step. If you're new here, this channel is about old, forgotten, and often deliberately overlooked growing methods, the kind of techniques that worked for generations before anyone ever sold a soaker hose or an automatic sprinkler timer. If that's useful to you, consider subscribing, because that's the only thing that keeps a channel like this reaching people instead of disappearing into the algorithm. Let's get into the method. Every modern gardening resource you'll find is built around one assumption. You will water your garden regularly on a schedule, probably with a hose or an irrigation system, and the entire design of a modern raised bed or in-ground row garden depends on that assumption being true. Loose, fluffy, amended soil drains fast. Shallow root systems, encouraged by frequent shallow watering, stay near the surface where moisture evaporates fastest. Bare soil between plants bakes in direct sun and loses whatever moisture it had within hours of a rainfall. None of this is wrong exactly, and it's just optimized for a world where water is cheap, plentiful, and always available on demand. That world is a very recent invention. For most of human history, and for communities today that deliberately avoid dependence on modern utilities, gardens had to survive on rainfall alone because there was no other option. And when survival depends on it, you don't get to treat watering as a chore you do when you remember. You have to build the garden itself to not need it in the first place. That's the entire premise of what I'm about to show you. This isn't a watering technique. It's the absence of one, built into the soil and the structure of the garden from the ground up. I first heard about this from an older gentleman running a farm stand about 40 minutes from where I live, in a heavily Amish and Mennonite farming community. I'd stopped to buy sweet corn, made some offhand comment about how brutal the drought had been that summer, and he said something that stuck with me, that he hadn't watered his garden in longer than I'd been alive, and it had never once failed him. I assumed at first he meant he had a well and an irrigation system he just didn't think of as watering in the traditional sense. He didn't. What he actually had was a garden built using a method passed down through his own family and community for generations, going back to farming practices that predate rural electrification, let alone modern drip irrigation. The method itself isn't unique to the Amish specifically. Versions of it show up in old dry farming techniques from multiple cultures that farmed in low rainfall regions long before modern infrastructure existed. But the Amish community's continued, deliberate use of it, generation after generation, without ever switching to modern irrigation even when it became available and cheap, is what kept it alive and provable at a scale most backyard experiments never reach. 60 years of consistent results on the same plot of ground is not a fluke. It's a demonstration. Here's what actually makes this work, broken into the 3 things that matter most: the soil structure, the mulch layer, and the spacing. The first piece is deep, permanently undisturbed soil structure. Instead of tilling the garden every season, which destroys the natural channels and pore structure that let water sink deep and stay there, this method disturbs the soil as little as possible year after year, letting it build a stable structure full of tiny channels left behind by decomposed roots, earthworm tunnels, and organic matter breaking down in place. That structure acts like a sponge that holds water far below the surface, safe from evaporation, and lets plant roots grow deep to reach it instead of staying shallow the way they do in loose, frequently disturbed soil. The second piece is a permanent, thick mulch layer. Not the thin, decorative layer of mulch most people put down, but a genuinely deep layer, often 4 to 6 inches, of straw, spoiled hay, or similar material, replenished every season rather than removed. This layer does 3 things at once. It blocks sunlight from ever reaching bare soil, which nearly eliminates evaporation from the surface. It breaks the impact of rain so water soaks in gently instead of running off, and as it slowly breaks down, it continuously feeds organic matter into the soil below, which is what builds and maintains that sponge-like structure over years and decades. The third piece is wider spacing than most modern gardens use. Plants spaced closer together compete directly for the same limited pocket of soil moisture. Spacing them further apart, with mulch covering the ground between them, means each plant has access to a larger reservoir of stored moisture deep in undisturbed soil that it doesn't have to share. None of these three pieces alone would get you to zero watering. Deep mulch alone helps, but doesn't fix compacted or frequently tilled soil underneath. Undisturbed soil alone helps, but still loses moisture fast without mulch protecting the surface. It's the combination, deep undisturbed soil, thick permanent mulch, and generous spacing, working together for years, that eventually produces a garden that simply doesn't need supplemental water because the ground itself has become a reservoir. I want to be completely direct about something before I go further. You cannot build this in a weekend and expect zero watering this season. The 60-year garden I'm describing didn't reach zero watering on day one either. This is a method that improves every single year it's maintained, because the underlying soil structure that makes it work takes real time to build. In year one, you'll almost certainly still need to water, especially during establishment and during genuinely severe heat. What you're doing that first year is laying the foundation, building the mulch layer, stopping tillage, and letting the soil start to rebuild its natural structure instead of fighting it. Most people who try this and give up do so because they expected dramatic results immediately and got modest ones instead. By year 2 or 3, most gardeners using this method report a significant drop in watering needs, often to just a handful of waterings during the very worst heat, rather than a regular weekly schedule. By year 4 or 5, many reach the point of needing water only in genuinely extreme, prolonged drought conditions. The full never that the 60-year garden represents is the result of decades of consistent, undisturbed accumulation. But you get real, meaningful benefits every single year along the way, not just at the finish line. Here's what you actually need to start building a version of this in your own garden. And the good news is that almost none of it costs money if you have access to a few basic materials. You need a mulch source. Straw is the traditional choice and what's used in the 60-year garden I saw, because it breaks down at a good rate and doesn't mat down into an impermeable layer the way some materials do. Spoiled hay works too, though it can introduce weed seeds if it wasn't properly cured. Shredded leaves, especially if you have access to a large volume from fall cleanup, are another excellent and completely free option. You need a source of organic matter to layer beneath the mulch when you're first establishing a new bed. Well-aged compost or aged manure works well here, since it jumpstarts the soil biology that will eventually build the deep structure this method depends on. You don't need any special tools beyond a rake or fork for spreading mulch, and notably, you don't need a tiller, which is one less piece of equipment most people assume a garden requires. Step 1 is choosing your area and, critically, committing to never tilling it again. This is the hardest psychological step for most modern gardeners, because tilling feels productive. It feels like you're doing something to help the soil. In this method, tilling is the single biggest thing working against you, since it destroys the exact structure you're trying to build. Step 2 is laying down a base layer directly on the existing ground without digging it up first. If you're starting on lawn or weedy ground, a layer of cardboard or thick layers of newspaper works well here to suppress what's growing without any digging, followed by a few inches of compost or aged manure on top of that. Step 3 is adding your mulch layer on top of that base. 4 to 6 inches, spread evenly, right up close to where your plants will go, but not directly against the stems. Step 4 is planting directly into that layered bed, pulling back the mulch slightly to place seeds or transplants into the compost layer beneath, then pulling the mulch back around the plant once it's established. Step 5, and this is the part that requires the most patience, is replenishing the mulch layer every single season, rather than letting it fully break down and disappear. Each year before planting, add another layer on top of whatever remains from the previous season. And this is what continuously builds soil depth and structure over time, rather than starting over from scratch every year. Step 6 is watering only as needed during that critical first year or two while the system establishes, gradually reducing as you notice the soil holding moisture longer between rains. Pay attention to how deep the soil stays moist after a rain. That's your real signal of progress, far more useful than a calendar or a fixed schedule. I want to walk through what a realistic progression looks like, based on both the 60-year garden and my own smaller scale attempt at applying this method over the past several seasons. In the first year, watering needs typically drop by somewhere around a third compared to a conventional bed of the same size and plants, simply from the mulch layer reducing evaporation, even before the deeper soil structure has had time to develop. By the second and third year, with the mulch layer consistently replenished and the soil left undisturbed, Many gardeners report needing to water only during multi-week dry stretches rather than on any kind of regular schedule, a reduction that often reaches 70 or 80% compared to where they started. The visible signs of progress along the way are worth watching for. Soil that stays visibly darker and cooler to the touch longer after rain, an increase in earthworm activity when you gently pull back the mulch to look, and plants that show noticeably less wilting during brief hot spells compared to how they behaved in earlier seasons. The 60-year garden represents the theoretical ceiling of this method, decades of undisturbed, continuously mulched soil, building a moisture reservoir deep enough to buffer against essentially any dry spell short of true prolonged drought. Most people won't garden the same plot for 60 years, but the trajectory toward that result starts showing real, measurable benefits within the first 2 or 3 seasons. The single biggest mistake people make trying this is impatience, giving up after one dry week in year 1 because the garden still needed watering, without understanding that the whole point of this method is a multi-year trajectory, not an instant fix. The second mistake is under-mulching. People put down an inch of mulch, call it done, and wonder why they're not seeing results. An inch of mulch does almost nothing for moisture retention compared to a genuine 4 to 6 inch layer. This method requires committing to real depth, replenished every season, not a token gesture. The third mistake is tilling, just this once, to fix a problem. A compacted spot, a weed issue, whatever the reason. Every time the soil gets disturbed, you're setting back the structural development that took seasons to build. If you're serious about this method, tilling has to be off the table entirely, permanently, not just most of the time. The fourth mistake is using the wrong mulch material, something that mats down into an impermeable layer like fresh grass clippings applied too thick, which can actually block water from penetrating rather than helping it soak in. Straw, aged hay, and shredded leaves all allow water through while still blocking evaporation, which is the balance you need. I get asked constantly whether this works in every climate, and the honest answer is that it works best where you get at least periodic, meaningful rainfall throughout the growing season. This method dramatically reduces how much supplemental water you need, but it isn't true magic that creates water from nothing. In genuinely arid climates with long stretches of near-zero rainfall, you'll likely still need some irrigation, though typically far less than a conventional garden in the same location would require. Soil type matters too. Heavy clay soils see dramatic improvement from this method because the added organic matter and reduced disturbance help break up compaction over time. Very sandy soils benefit as well, though it may take slightly longer to build the moisture-holding structure since sandy soil naturally drains faster. Almost any starting soil improves under this approach. It's really a question of how quickly, not whether it works at all. I want to slow down on why undisturbed soil actually holds water so much better, because understanding the mechanism is what will keep you patient during the years it takes to build. Healthy, undisturbed soil isn't a solid mass. It's full of a network of tiny pores and channels, some created by decomposing roots that leave behind hollow tunnels as they break down, some created by earthworms and other soil organisms moving through the ground, and some created by the natural aggregation of soil particles into small clumps with space between them. This network acts like a system of tiny pipes and reservoirs. Rain that falls on this kind of soil doesn't just sit on the surface or run off. It travels down through these channels and gets held in the spaces between soil aggregates, sometimes many feet below the surface, far below where evaporation or shallow plant roots can reach it. Tilling destroys this network completely, every single time it happens. The channels collapse, the aggregates break apart into fine, structureless particles, and the soil that results holds far less water and drains it far faster, which is exactly why tilled gardens need frequent watering. You've destroyed the storage system the soil would otherwise provide for free. The mulch layer above ground works with this underground structure rather than replacing it. By blocking direct sun and wind from ever touching the soil surface, the top inch or two of soil, which in an uncovered garden bakes dry within hours of a rain, stays moist far longer, which means water has time to actually travel downward into that deep storage network instead of evaporating before it gets the chance. Put simply, the deep soil structure is the reservoir, and the mulch layer is what gives rainwater enough time to actually reach it instead of evaporating on the way. Neither piece works nearly as well without the other, which is why so many partial attempts at this method, mulch without stopping tillage or reduced tillage without real mulch depth, produce underwhelming results compared to doing both together consistently for years. I've heard from a number of people who tried building a version of this after seeing similar methods discussed in older farming communities, and the pattern in their results lines up closely with what I experienced myself. A common thread is that the biggest surprise isn't the water savings themselves, but how much less weeding is required once the mulch layer is established. A thick, consistently maintained mulch layer suppresses the vast majority of weed seeds from ever germinating, since they're denied both light and easy access to the soil surface. Several people mention this as the benefit that actually convinced them to stick with the method through the slower first year, even before the watering benefits became obvious. Another consistent observation is a change in how plants respond to heat waves specifically. Even in year one, before deep watering benefits fully kick in, plants in heavily mulched, undisturbed beds tend to show less midday wilting during short heat spikes compared to identical plants in a conventional bed nearby, likely because the soil surface temperature stays significantly cooler under a thick mulch layer than it does when directly exposed to sun. A few people also reported an increase in visible earthworm activity within the first season, which lines up with the underlying goal of the method. Earthworms are both a sign that the soil biology is recovering and an active contributor to building the very channel network that makes deep water storage possible in the first place. Seeing more of them isn't just a nice side effect, it's a genuine indicator that the system is working as intended. Once established, this method doesn't disappear into zero maintenance. It just shifts what maintenance looks like from frequent shallow tasks like watering to a much smaller number of deeper seasonal tasks. In early spring, before planting, the main task is assessing the previous season's mulch layer and topping it back up to full depth wherever it's thinned out over winter, along with a light layer of fresh compost if the bed is due for a nutrient boost. Through the growing season itself, maintenance drops to almost nothing beyond occasional spot checks, pulling back mulch near a plant that looks stressed to check soil moisture at root depth, or adding a bit of extra mulch anywhere it's gotten thin from foot traffic or wind. At the end of the season, rather than clearing the bed down to bare soil the way a conventional garden might, spent plants are typically cut at the base rather than pulled, leaving root systems in place to decompose in the ground and continue contributing to that underground channel network, while the above-ground material either gets added to the mulch layer directly or composted separately and returned later. Over winter, in colder climates, an extra layer of mulch is often added as a protective cap, which then breaks down further by spring and gets folded into the following year's layer. This rhythm, top up in spring, maintain lightly through summer, cut rather than pull at season's end, cap in winter, is genuinely lower effort year over year than the constant watering and repeated tilling a conventional garden demands, even though it looks different from what most modern gardening advice describes as routine care. While the core principles stay the same everywhere, the specific way this method gets applied shifts depending on climate, and it's worth understanding those adjustments rather than applying one rigid version everywhere. In regions with hot, humid summers, mulch depth needs careful attention, since overly thick mulch and high humidity can sometimes stay too wet at the base and encourage fungal issues against plant stems. Pulling mulch back slightly from direct stem contact matters more in these climates than in drier ones. In regions with cold winters and heavy snow, the protective winter mulch cap becomes especially valuable, since it insulates the soil biology and root systems through freeze-thaw cycles that would otherwise disrupt the channel network that took seasons to build. In naturally drier regions with lower annual rainfall overall, the method still provides major benefits, but as I mentioned earlier, it's less likely to reach a literal zero watering result, since there's simply less rainfall available to store in the first place. In these climates, pairing this method with rainwater collection from a roof or gutter system tends to close much of that remaining gap, since you're capturing and directing water you'd otherwise lose entirely, straight into a soil system already built to hold onto it efficiently. In regions with heavy clay soil, specifically, initial results sometimes look slower than in other soil types, simply because clay takes longer to break up and develop the pore structure this method depends on, but clay soils also tend to show the most dramatic long-term improvement, since they start out holding on to both too much water in wet periods and too little usable water in dry ones, and this method directly addresses both problems over time. A handful of questions come up often enough that I want to address them directly. Can I use this method in raised beds, or does it only work in ground? It works in raised beds too, though the depth of the bed matters. A shallow raised bed simply has less total soil volume to build a deep moisture reservoir within, so results tend to be somewhat more modest than a full in-ground bed with unlimited depth beneath it. What about existing gardens I've already tilled for years? You can absolutely start this method on an already established garden. The soil will simply be starting from a more depleted structural baseline, meaning the multi-year timeline to strong results may run slightly longer than starting on truly undisturbed ground, but the trajectory and end result are the same. Do I need to remove all the mulch before planting each season? No. And this is actually one of the more common misunderstandings. You want to preserve as much of the existing mulch layer as possible each year, simply topping it up rather than removing and replacing it, since the partially decomposed layer underneath is actively contributing organic matter to the soil below. Will this attract pests like slugs or rodents? A thick mulch layer can provide habitat for slugs in particularly damp climates, which is a fair trade-off to be aware of. Keeping mulch pulled back slightly from direct stem contact and monitoring for slug activity in the first couple of seasons helps manage this without abandoning the method entirely. It's worth distinguishing this from a few other techniques that get lumped into the same no-water gardening conversation online because they solve different problems and sometimes get confused with each other. Xeriscaping, the landscaping approach built around drought-tolerant native plants and gravel ground cover, achieves low water use by choosing plants that simply need very little to begin with. That's a completely different strategy from what we're discussing here, which is about growing regular, thirsty vegetable crops, tomatoes, squash, beans, without needing to water them, by changing the soil itself rather than changing what you grow in it. Hugelkultur, the practice of burying logs and woody debris under a raised mound of soil, shares some underlying logic with this method since decomposing wood underground also creates water-holding structure over time. The difference is mainly one of speed and effort. Hugelkultur requires a significant upfront construction effort and large volumes of woody material, while the deep mulch, no-till approach I'm describing here builds similar benefits gradually, using much simpler and more universally available materials, without any major excavation. Drip irrigation with mulch on top is a popular modern hybrid that a lot of gardening content recommends, and it does reduce water use significantly compared to overhead sprinklers. But it's still fundamentally a watering system, just a more efficient one, rather than the complete elimination of watering that this method aims for once fully established. It's a reasonable middle ground for people not ready to commit to a multi-year no-till approach, but it's not the same destination. Understanding these distinctions matters because a lot of the disappointment people report with no water gardening methods online comes from mixing pieces of different approaches without understanding which mechanism is actually responsible for the result, then wondering why a partial combination didn't produce the outcome a fully committed version of one specific method would. It's worth sitting for a moment on why a method like this survived intact for 60-plus years in one particular community when so much of modern agriculture moved in the opposite direction entirely, toward heavier tillage, synthetic irrigation, and soil treated more like a growing medium to be managed chemically than a living system to be preserved. The Amish farming tradition, broadly, prioritizes practices that don't depend on external infrastructure the community doesn't control directly. No reliance on an electrical grid for irrigation pumps, no dependence on a municipal water supply that could face restrictions during a drought, no vulnerability to a well-running low during exactly the years water matters most. A gardening method that produces reliable food regardless of what's happening with the electrical grid or the local water table isn't just an interesting technique to this community, it's a foundational requirement for how they choose to live. That's a very different starting incentive than a hobbyist gardener deciding to try something new for a season, and it's part of why the method got refined, maintained, and passed down so faithfully rather than being abandoned the first time a cheaper, faster alternative appeared. That context matters if you're trying this yourself, because the payoff isn't just a lower water bill. It's a garden that keeps producing food through the exact conditions: drought, water restrictions, an unreliable well, a power outage affecting a well pump, where a conventional irrigation-dependent garden would fail first. What draws me to methods like this isn't really about saving money on a water bill, though that's a real and welcome side effect. It's about the deeper idea underneath it, that a garden built to work with natural rainfall patterns rather than depending entirely on infrastructure and a water bill arriving every month is a garden that keeps producing even when the systems around it don't. That's the same reason a community that has farmed this way for generations, deliberately outside of modern utility infrastructure, never had a reason to switch to sprinklers and drip lines even once they became available and cheap. When your garden already doesn't need them, there's nothing to switch to. That's really the heart of what self-sufficient gardening means to me. Not rejecting every modern tool on principle, but understanding which old methods were solving a real problem so well that modern conveniences never actually improved on them. This is one of those methods. If you want to try building a version of this yourself, start small. One bed, real depth of mulch, and a genuine commitment to leaving that soil undisturbed from here forward. Track how it changes over the next 2 or 3 seasons rather than expecting a miracle by next Tuesday. If this was useful, share it with someone who's tired of dragging a hose around their garden every evening in July. Subscribe if you want to see how my own version of this bed has progressed season by season, because I've been documenting it since I started, and the changes even in the first 2 years surprised me more than I expected. If you're worried this all sounds like more effort than it's worth, remember what we walked through. This isn't a new task added to your gardening routine, it's a replacement for tasks you're already doing. Tilling is a task, watering is a task. This method removes both of those over time and replaces them with one seasonal mulch top-up that takes less effort than either. You're not adding work to your garden. You're trading frequent ongoing work for a smaller amount of deliberate seasonal work in exchange for a garden that gets more resilient every single year instead of needing the exact same inputs season after season forever. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Vide.